He built his empire with power and control, but inside his mansion, his only son hadn't smiled in years. Therapists called it trauma, doctors called it a phase, but deep down, billionaire James Coleman knew it was something far deeper, something he couldn't fix with money. Every morning, the mansion woke to silence. The sound of clocks ticking was louder than voices. David, his little boy, moved like a shadow, quiet and lost, his small steps echoing through the marble halls. Since the night his mother died, the boy had not said a single word, not even a cry, not even a whisper. James tried everything. He brought in doctors from London, child specialists from New York, and even speech experts who charged more than some people earned in a year, but nothing worked. They all left with polite smiles and empty promises, telling him to give it time, but time only made the silence louder. Sandra had been in the house for just 3 weeks. She came quietly, a young black maid from the city, known for her patience and neat work. She was not educated like the rest of the staff, but she had something they didn't, a calmness that filled the rooms she entered. She cleaned without noise, moved without complaint, and treated every corner of the mansion as if it were holy ground. The other workers often ignored her. Some laughed behind her back, calling her the quiet cleaner, but she didn't mind. Sandra was used to being unseen. She had left behind a small apartment in Queens, a past full of struggles and memories that hurt too much to keep. She came here to start again, not to be noticed. That morning, the air in the mansion felt colder than usual. Sandra was scrubbing the floor of the east hallway, her bucket beside her, the scent of soap drifting softly through the air. Outside, through the wide glass windows, she could see David sitting alone in the garden. The boy's eyes were empty, fixed on the ground, a toy car lying unused beside him. Sandra paused. Something in that sight touched her heart. She had seen that kind of silence before, in her own life, years ago, when she had lost someone too. It was the kind of silence that didn't need words to explain its pain. She dipped her hand into the bucket to wring out the mop, and her fingers brushed the layer of bubbles floating on the water. For a second, she froze. A small memory flickered in her mind, her childhood, when she and her younger brother would blow soap bubbles in front of their mother's small house, laughing as the bubbles floated toward the sun. That was a happy time, a time she had buried long ago. Without thinking, she lifted her wet hand, shaped her lips softly, and blew. A small bubble rose into the air. It shimmered in the sunlight, catching colors of blue and gold as it floated toward the garden. Sandra smiled faintly, watching it drift. Outside, little David looked up. It was the first time she had seen him move like that. His head tilted slightly, his eyes following the bubble with full attention. He even lifted his hand, as if trying to catch it. When it popped, he blinked and looked around, searching. Sandra's heart tightened. She hesitated, then blew another bubble, smaller this time. It floated gently toward him again. David's lips moved, just a little, like he wanted to say something. His fingers reached for the air, and for a brief second, he smiled a small, weak smile, but real. Sandra's eyes softened. She didn't speak, didn't call out to him. She just kept blowing, one bubble after another, letting them dance in the morning light. Upstairs, in his office, James Coleman sat behind his desk, staring at financial reports he couldn't read. His eyes were tired, his hands restless. He had barely slept in weeks. The security monitor on his desk showed different corners of the mansion, as it always did. One of the screens suddenly caught his eye, the garden camera. He leaned closer. There was his son, outside, sitting near the cherry tree. But he wasn't alone. A woman was nearby. James frowned. He tapped the screen to zoom in. The cleaner, Sandra, was crouched near the glass door, blowing bubbles into the air. His son was watching her, smiling, moving. James froze. His heartbeat quickened as he leaned closer to the screen. He hadn't seen David smile since the funeral. For a few seconds, he just watched, unsure how to feel. Something inside him wanted to cry with relief. But another part, the colder, prouder part, felt something else. Anger. Anger that his son's first reaction in months had come not from him, not from the experts he had hired, but from a maid who barely spoke English. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. He stormed out of his office, his polished shoes striking the marble with force. Sandra didn't hear him at first. She was too focused on the boy. But when she turned and saw him marching down the hallway, his face hard and pale, she froze. James stopped a few feet from her. His voice came out sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" Sandra flinched. The wand slipped from her hand, falling into the bucket with a splash. "Sir, I was just what?" he cut in. "Playing games while you're supposed to be cleaning?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Behind him, the other staff had gathered quietly, peeking from the corridor. James's voice rose again. "You are not paid to distract my son. Is that clear?" Sandra lowered her head. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean any harm." But before he could speak again, a sound stopped them both. A small, quiet sound. David had stood up. His little hand reached toward the glass door, and his mouth moved as if to say something. James turned sharply, staring at his son. "David?" he whispered. But no word came out of the boy's lips, only silence and a tear rolling down his cheek. Sandra looked at him, her eyes trembling, knowing she had touched something fragile, something that no one else had reached. James stood still for a long moment, his anger slowly fading into confusion. Then he turned away, his face unreadable. "Clean this up," he muttered, "and stay away from my son." He walked off without looking back. Sandra stood frozen, her heart heavy, watching the boy through the glass. David pressed his small hand against it, eyes still on the place where the bubble had burst. And in that silence, Sandra knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. The air felt heavy, as if the walls remembered what had happened the day before. Sandra moved carefully, cleaning the silver frames in the corridor, her mind far away. She could still hear James Coleman's voice in her head, angry and cold. "Stay away from my son." Those words had followed her all night. She barely slept, turning in her small servant room, wondering if she had done something wrong. She had only wanted to help, only wanted to give the boy a little smile. But maybe in this house, even kindness was forbidden. Downstairs, the staff whispered. They had all seen what happened. The cook, Mrs. Parker, shook her head as she arranged plates on the counter. "You should be careful, love," she said softly. "Mr. Coleman doesn't like surprises. He's been through a lot." Sandra nodded. "I understand." But inside, she didn't. How could showing care to a child be a crime? Outside, the garden looked empty. The cherry tree where David usually sat stood still under the morning light. Sandra wanted to look, but she forced herself not to. She had already been warned once. Upstairs, in his office, James sat at his desk staring at his laptop screen, but he wasn't working. His mind kept returning to what he saw on the security footage. That smile, his son's small, almost forgotten smile. It had been real, and it came from something as silly as a soap bubble. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. How could something so simple reach where all his money couldn't? Every therapist he had hired, every program he had paid for, every expert, none had managed to do that. Yet that woman, that quiet maid, somehow had. He tried to push the thought away, but he couldn't. It made him feel weak, powerless, almost ashamed. He had spent years building an image of control, yet one humble maid had done what he could not. Later that day, he walked through the mansion, pretending to check on the staff. When he passed through the back hallway, he saw Sandra polishing the floor, her head bent low. She didn't look up. For a moment, he stopped, watching her hands move gently over the marble. He wanted to say something, maybe even thank her, but pride stopped him. Instead, he just cleared his throat and walked away. Hours passed. The afternoon sun fell softly over the garden, and Sandra went about her work quietly. But her heart wasn't calm. Each time she passed a window, she looked out, hoping to see David, but he wasn't there. By evening, she finally saw him. The boy was sitting near the glass door again, The same spot as before, his toy car resting beside him. His eyes looked tired, lonely, almost lost. Sandra froze. She wanted to wave, but she remembered James's warning. Her chest ached as she turned away. She picked up her mop and tried to focus on cleaning, but the image of that small face stayed in her mind. She thought of her own son, the one she hadn't seen in years. The memory was too painful. Back then, before she came to New York, she had lost everything. Her husband had left, her little boy had been taken by social services after an accident she never meant to cause. Every day since, she carried that guilt quietly, working from house to house, praying she might see him again one day. Maybe that was why she cared so much for David, because, in his eyes, she saw her own child. When she finished her work, she returned to the laundry room to put away her things. That was when she heard it, a small noise, like footsteps. She turned and froze. David was standing by the doorway. He looked smaller than before, his pajamas loose on his tiny shoulders. He wasn't supposed to be there. His nanny should have been upstairs. Sandra knelt slowly, afraid to scare him. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered gently. "You shouldn't be here. It's late." David didn't answer. He looked down at her mop bucket, then at her face. His eyes were full of something she couldn't explain, confusion, but also trust. She smiled softly. "It's okay," she said. "Do you want to go back upstairs?" He didn't move. Instead, he took one small step closer, then another. Finally, he reached for the mop handle, his fingers brushing against hers. Sandra froze. She didn't know what to do. She glanced toward the camera in the corner of the hallway, then back at him. She wanted to protect him, but she was afraid of being caught again. Before she could decide, he did something that broke her heart. He reached out his tiny hand and touched her cheek, just a small touch, soft and gentle, as if he wanted to say thank you without words. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, whispering, "It's okay, baby. You're okay." Then, suddenly, a deep voice echoed down the hall. "David!" The boy flinched. James was standing at the end of the corridor, his face full of shock. He rushed forward, pulling David into his arms. "What are you doing out here?" he said, his tone a mix of worry and anger. "You're supposed to be in bed." David clung to his father's shirt but said nothing. James looked at Sandra. "Did you bring him here?" "No, sir," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "He came on his own." James looked down at his son, then back at her. His jaw tightened, his breath sharp. He wanted to scold her again, but then he saw something, the wet tear mark on her cheek, the soft look in her eyes. He paused, just for a second. "Go back to your room," he said quietly. "We'll talk in the morning." Sandra nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned and walked away slowly, her heart beating hard, every step heavier than the last. That night, she lay on her small bed staring at the ceiling. The image of David's eyes wouldn't leave her. He had come to her, not to anyone else. She didn't understand why, but she felt it deep in her chest, a connection she couldn't explain. Upstairs, James sat by David's bed. The boy had fallen asleep holding his father's sleeve. James brushed his hair gently, wondering what was happening to his son, and to himself. He looked out through the window toward the garden, where the moonlight touched the grass, and for the first time, he felt unsure of everything he believed about control, rules, and order. Somewhere deep down, a thought began to grow. Maybe the maid hadn't done anything wrong after all. Maybe she had done something he couldn't. And as the night settled over the mansion, both Sandra and James lay awake in different rooms, not knowing that this small moment had already tied their lives together in a way that neither could ever undo. The morning sun entered the Coleman mansion quietly, slipping through tall windows and resting on the polished floor. Sandra was already awake before anyone else. She moved around the kitchen in silence, her thoughts heavy from the night before. The image of little David touching her cheek kept replaying in her mind. It had felt like a moment of trust, something pure, something she didn't want to lose. But she also remembered his father's voice, sharp and warning. She didn't know if she would still have a job by the end of the day. Every sound made her heart jump. Every footstep in the hallway made her afraid. Mrs. Parker, the cook, came in soon after. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" she asked, noticing Sandra's tired eyes. Sandra shook her head slightly. "I'm fine," she said. "Just had a long night." Mrs. Parker sighed as she tied her apron. "Mr. Coleman has a meeting in the city today. Maybe it will give you some peace. He's been restless lately." Sandra nodded, hoping that was true. Upstairs, James was dressing for work. His reflection in the mirror looked tired. He adjusted his tie twice before removing it completely. He couldn't focus. His mind kept going back to what he saw in the hallway, his son standing near that maid, touching her face like she was someone special. It made no sense, yet something about it stayed with him. Before leaving, he walked quietly into David's room. The boy was sitting on the floor, building a small tower with colored blocks. James knelt beside him. "Morning, champ," he said softly. David didn't look up. James picked up a red block and placed it on the tower. "That's a good one," he said. "You like red, huh?" Still no answer. He smiled weakly. "I'll be back soon, all right? Be good." He stood, feeling the weight of silence between them. As he reached the door, something made him stop. David was looking at the window. His small hand lifted and pointed toward the garden. James turned his gaze and saw nothing but sunlight. Still, the meaning was clear. He wanted to go outside. James hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he whispered, "later today." By noon, James had left for his meeting, and the mansion returned to its quiet rhythm. Sandra finished dusting the hallway and walked toward the laundry room. She told herself she would keep her distance. She couldn't afford to lose her job. But when she passed the glass doors that led to the garden, she saw him again, little David, sitting near the same cherry tree. Her steps slowed. He was alone, no nanny, no guard nearby, just him and his small toy car. He was drawing on the stone path with a piece of chalk. Sandra pressed her lips together. She shouldn't go near him. She remembered the warning. But then she saw the way he sat, his head bent, his shoulders low. Something inside her broke. She couldn't ignore that sadness. She walked out carefully, her shoes quiet against the stone. When she reached a few steps away, she stopped. "Hello, David," she said softly. "I'm just cleaning here, okay?" He didn't speak, but he looked up at her. His eyes were calm, curious, not afraid. He drew another small circle on the ground. Sandra realized it wasn't just a random mark. There were several circles around him, drawn neatly, side by side. She crouched down a little. "That's nice," she whispered. "You like circles, don't you?" David glanced at her hand, then at the bucket she carried. The surface of the soap water shimmered slightly under the sunlight. He pointed to it. Sandra froze. "You want the bubbles?" she asked quietly. He nodded. Her heart began to race. She looked around. No one was watching. Slowly, she dipped her fingers into the bucket, lifted them close to her lips, and blew. A small bubble rose into the air, soft and round, catching the light. David's eyes followed it. His lips moved slightly, but no sound came. He reached for it with one small hand, smiling faintly when it popped. Sandra smiled back. She blew another one, then another, smaller this time. Each one floated gently before disappearing. The boy laughed. It was a tiny sound, light and quick, but it made her eyes fill with tears. It had been so long since anyone in that house had laughed like that. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly. It was Mrs. Parker. The older woman stopped, her mouth slightly open. "Lord above," she whispered, watching David laugh. "He's smiling." Sandra stood up quickly, nervous. "Please don't say anything," she said quietly. "I don't want to get in trouble." Mrs. Parker nodded slowly. "I won't. But whatever you're doing, keep doing it. That boy hasn't laughed in 2 years." The sound of a car pulling up made them both turn. James had come home early. Sandra's chest tightened. She hurried to pick up her bucket, wiping her hands quickly. Mrs. Parker whispered, "Go to the laundry room." But before Sandra could move, David ran toward her and held her hand. She froze. James stepped out of the car and saw them through the glass doors. For a moment, he didn't move. His eyes softened at the sight of his son smiling, holding someone's hand. Then his face hardened again, pride pulling his emotions back. He walked inside with quick steps. David saw him coming and let go of Sandra's hand, his small smile fading. "Sandra?" James said firmly as he entered the hall. "A word, please?" Her stomach dropped. She followed him into the office quietly. He stood near the window, his back to her. "I thought I made myself clear," he said. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "But he came to me. I didn't mean to break your rule." He turned slowly. "And if he did? What then? You think this is your place?" Sandra looked down. "No, sir. I just wanted to help." James sighed heavily. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to calm himself. "Do you even understand what you're dealing with? My son hasn't spoken since his mother died. He doesn't need confusion." Sandra looked up gently. "He doesn't need confusion, sir, but he needs someone to stay." James stared at her, unsure how to respond. Her voice wasn't bold, just honest. "Sometimes," she said softly, "children don't need fixing. They just need someone who doesn't walk away." James turned toward the window again, his jaw tight. He didn't reply. Sandra waited for a moment, then stepped back. "I'll go back to work, sir." When she left, the room stayed quiet. James stood there, staring out at the garden. He could see David picking up the chalk again, drawing small circles on the stone. He whispered under his breath, almost to himself, "What are you doing to my son?" But deep down, a part of him already knew the answer. That night, long after everyone slept, James found himself replaying the security footage once again. Each time he saw Sandra with his son, his anger faded a little more, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: hope. And though he wouldn't admit it yet, that hope scared him more than anything else. Days turned into weeks, and something quiet began to change inside the Coleman mansion. It was not loud, it was not quick, but it was real. The silence that used to fill the halls now carried a soft warmth, the kind that felt alive. David started spending more time in the garden. Every morning, he sat under the cherry tree waiting. Sandra would pass by with her cleaning bucket, pretending not to notice at first, but she always stopped for a few minutes. She would blow bubbles into the air, slow and gentle, while David watched them float and burst. Sometimes he would giggle softly. Other times he would just stare, lost in the colors. None of this went unnoticed by James. Every day, before leaving for work, he watched them from his office window. He no longer felt the anger he once did. Instead, he felt something he could not explain. It was confusing and painful at the same time. He wanted to join them, but pride always held him back. One afternoon, James returned home early. He had left an important meeting halfway because his mind could not stay focused. He parked his car quietly and entered through the side door. From the hallway, he could see through the glass to the garden. Sandra was kneeling on the grass, showing David how to dip his hands into the soapy water and blow his own bubbles. His small fingers trembled, but he tried again and again. Then suddenly, a bubble formed. It rose into the sunlight, shining softly before popping on his nose. David laughed. It was a bright, honest laugh, and the sound made James stop walking. His eyes watered without warning. He leaned against the wall, hiding so they would not see him. When the moment ended, Sandra wiped David's hands with a towel. Her face carried a look James had never seen before, gentle and full of patience. There was something in that look that made him feel smaller, like all his success and money meant nothing next to that simple care. Later that evening, he found Sandra cleaning the dining room. He stopped by the door. "Sandra," he said quietly. She turned, startled. "Yes, sir?" He stepped inside. "About earlier, I saw you with David." Her heart tightened. She set the cloth down carefully. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to overstep." James shook his head. "No, you didn't." He laughed. "I haven't heard that sound in years." Sandra nodded slowly. "He's healing, sir. It just takes time." He looked at her for a moment, studying her calm eyes. "How do you know how to reach him?" I don't, she said softly. I just see him. I don't force him to speak. I let him choose the moment. Her words hit him deeply. He lowered his gaze. I've tried everything money could buy, and none of it worked. Maybe I never gave him what he really needed. Sandra hesitated, then spoke gently. Sometimes, children don't need perfection, sir. They just need someone who listens, even when they have no words. James nodded, though his throat felt tight. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. My wife used to say that too. Sandra's eyes softened. She must have been a kind woman. She was, he said, almost whispering. David was her whole world. After she died, I thought if I kept everything perfect, I could protect him from more pain. But maybe I only built walls. Sandra didn't respond right away. She looked around the large dining room, the shining table, the spotless floor. Sometimes, she said slowly, walls don't keep pain away. They just keep love out. James looked up at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't name. You're right, he said quietly. That night, when he went upstairs, David was already asleep. A small drawing lay on the table beside his bed, a round circle drawn with blue crayon. James smiled faintly, remembering the bubbles. He sat beside the bed, his hand resting gently on his son's small shoulder. I'm trying, he whispered. I promise. The next day, Sandra noticed something different. When she entered the kitchen, James was already there, standing near the counter with 2 cups of coffee. Good morning, he said. She blinked, surprised. Good morning, sir. He held out 1 cup. You take your coffee black, right? She hesitated, unsure if this was a test. Yes, sir. He smiled slightly. Call me James, just for today. She didn't answer, but she took the cup with a shy nod. It was the first time she had seen him smile without effort. They both drank in silence. The air felt different, softer. James looked out through the window at the garden. He's waiting, he said quietly. Sandra followed his gaze. David was sitting under the tree, holding the bubble wand. Go to him, James said gently. He needs you. Sandra frowned slightly. You're sure, sir? He nodded. Yes. I think I've stopped fighting the wrong things. She set down her cup and walked out slowly. David's face lit up the moment he saw her. She knelt beside him, and together they began to blow bubbles into the sunlight. From the window, James watched. This time, he didn't hide. When Sandra turned her head slightly, their eyes met through the glass. He gave a small nod, and she smiled back softly. It became a routine. Each day after lunch, Sandra and David spent an hour together. Some days they played quietly, other days they just sat side by side drawing circles on the patio with chalk. The boy's world, once silent, was opening again. He still didn't speak, but he made small sounds, hums, sighs, gentle giggles. One afternoon, as they sat under the cherry tree, David pointed toward the sky. Sandra followed his hand. The sun was bright, and a single bird flew above them. Sky, she said softly. That's the sky, sweetheart. He turned his eyes back to her, his lips parted slightly. A small sound escaped, almost like a whisper. Sky, he said. Sandra froze. Her heart stopped for a moment. She blinked, afraid it wasn't real. What did you say, baby? He looked up again and repeated, a little louder, Sky. Tears filled her eyes. She didn't shout or cheer. She just placed her hand over his and whispered, That's right. That's the sky. Behind them, the glass door opened quietly. James had been watching. He had heard it too. His eyes widened, his breath trembling. He stepped forward, his voice low. He spoke? Sandra turned, nodding slowly. Yes, sir, he did. James walked closer, kneeling beside his son. Say it again, David. The boy smiled faintly and pointed upward. Sky. James covered his mouth with his hand. His eyes shone with tears. He looked at Sandra, his voice shaking. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for giving me back my son. Sandra smiled softly, her eyes full of warmth. You don't have to thank me, sir. He just needed to be seen. For a long time, the 3 of them sat there, watching the clouds drift above the mansion, bubbles floating around them like small pieces of light. But outside that peaceful garden, something else was waiting, something that would soon test everything they had just begun to build. The sound of laughter filled the Coleman mansion for the first time in years. David's voice, soft and careful, had become the heart of every day. He now said small words, sometimes whispered, sometimes clear. Sky. Blue. Mama. Each word felt like a miracle. Sandra and James worked together quietly, never speaking much about what had changed between them, but both knew something deep had shifted. James no longer hid behind his pride, and Sandra no longer walked in fear. Their lives had begun to blend in small, natural ways. But peace never lasted long in a world that loved control. One morning, as Sandra wiped the kitchen counter, she heard voices coming from the hallway. They were sharp and unfamiliar. She turned and saw two men in dark suits standing beside Mrs. Parker. Behind them, James looked tense. "Everything all right, sir?" Sandra asked carefully. James's eyes met hers for only a moment. "These men are from the board," he said quietly. "They just have some concerns about my household." Sandra felt her chest tighten. The taller man stepped forward. "Mrs. Sandra, is it?" he asked. "You've been spending quite a lot of time with Mr. Coleman's son, correct?" She hesitated. "I only look after him, sir. I clean and sometimes help when he's alone." The man's voice was cold. "You're not a licensed caregiver, are you?" Sandra shook her head. "No, sir." The second man opened a file. "Then I'm afraid this situation is unacceptable. There are rules, Mrs. Sandra, and boundaries. The company cannot risk a scandal." James's jaw tightened. "That's enough," he said. "She's done more for my son than any professional I've paid." "Be that as it may," the man replied, "this could be seen as negligence. A housemaid replacing trained therapists will not look good for you, Mr. Coleman." Sandra's hands shook slightly. She wanted to speak, but she stayed quiet. After they left, James sat down heavily at the table. The air between them was heavy. "I don't want you to worry," he said at last. "They're just doing their job." Sandra looked at him with sad eyes. "And what about my job, sir?" He hesitated. "I'll fix it." But by the next morning, the decision had already been made. An official letter came from his lawyers, saying Sandra would be temporarily released from duty until further notice. It was written in clean business words, but Sandra could read the truth behind them. She was being let go. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She folded her uniform neatly, placed it on the bed, and wrote a short note to Mrs. Parker thanking her for kindness. Then she walked out of the mansion quietly with her small bag in hand. Upstairs, David stood by the window, watching her leave, his small hand pressed against the glass. No one told him why she was gone, but he understood. That night, the house felt empty again. The silence returned, heavier than before. James tried to talk to David, but the boy only stared at the floor. He refused to eat, refused to play, refused even to go outside. 3 days passed. On the fourth night, James found his son sitting in the garden with a small bottle of soap water in his hands. He must have found it in the cleaning room. The boy dipped his fingers in and tried to blow, but no bubbles formed. James's throat tightened. He knelt beside him. "You miss her, don't you?" David nodded. His eyes glistened. James took the bottle gently. He dipped his own fingers, unsure what to do. His first bubble burst before it even rose. David laughed quietly through his tears. James smiled weakly and tried again. The second bubble floated, small and wobbly, before popping in front of them. For the first time, father and son laughed together. It was not perfect, but it was real. That same night, James made a decision. He could no longer let other people decide what was right for his child. The next morning, he drove across the city to a small apartment block. When he knocked on the door, Sandra opened it slowly. She looked surprised to see him standing there in a plain shirt, no suit, no pride, just a man with tired eyes. "Mr. Coleman?" she said softly. He didn't waste words. "Please come back. He asked for you." She looked at him for a long time. His voice had no command, only honesty. Finally she nodded. "All right, she whispered. When she returned to the mansion, Mrs. Parker hugged her tightly. Even the security guard smiled faintly. But the most powerful moment came when David saw her. He ran into her arms, holding her waist tightly. Sandra knelt and whispered, "I missed you too, sweetheart." From that day, things began to heal again. The laughter returned, the garden came alive, and even James seemed lighter. He no longer hid behind distance. Sometimes he joined them quietly, blowing bubbles beside his son. Months passed peacefully, until one afternoon a letter arrived that changed everything again. It came from David's late mother's parents, Leonard and Barbara Collins. They had filed for custody. They claimed James was unfit to raise a child and accused him of allowing unqualified domestic staff to influence his son's care. James's hands shook as he read the paper. He called Sandra into his office. "They're trying to take him," he said, his voice weak. Sandra's heart sank. "They don't know him, sir. You have to fight." And fight he did. Weeks later, the courtroom was filled with reporters and lawyers. James sat on one side, Sandra behind him quietly. Across the room sat the grandparents, cold and proud. Their lawyer spoke loudly about improper care, showing pictures of Sandra with David. The judge listened carefully. After hours of arguments, she turned to James. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Coleman?" He stood slowly. "My son is alive because of her," he said, pointing to Sandra. "I was a rich man with an empty home. She brought my boy back to me, not through training or rules, but through love. If that's wrong, then I am guilty." The courtroom was silent. Then, the judge did something unexpected. She looked at David. "Young man," she said gently, "can you tell me who makes you feel safe?" David froze. The room waited. Slowly, he stood up, his small body trembling. He walked past the lawyers, past his father, and stopped in front of Sandra. Everyone watched as he placed his small hand in hers and whispered one word into the microphone. "Bubbles." Tears filled every eye in the courtroom. The judge smiled softly and wrote her final words. "Custody remains with the father." When they left the court, James held Sandra's hand as they walked to the car. He didn't care about the cameras flashing or the reporters shouting questions. For the first time, he felt peace. Months later, the mansion opened a new wing called the Haven. It became a safe space for children like David, a place for healing through love, patience, and silence. Sandra helped run it, guiding children with the same kindness that once changed one little boy's world. One bright afternoon, David stood in the garden, holding his old bubble wand. James and Sandra stood beside him. He dipped the wand in the soap and blew a single bubble into the air. "That one's for Mum," he whispered. Sandra reached for James's hand. He took it. Together, they watched the bubble rise higher into the sky, carrying with it every tear, every lesson, and every piece of love they had built. For the first time, the Coleman house was not just a mansion. It was a home. Dear viewers, this story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from doctors, or from money, or from big words. Sometimes, it comes from patience, kindness, and the courage to stay when others walk away. Sandra didn't have riches, but she had love that could not be bought. And James, a man who once thought control was strength, learned that true power lives in gentleness. Through one act of care, a broken family found their voice again. If this story touched your heart, please tell us where you are watching from, and share what lesson you learned from it. We love hearing from every one of you. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who still believes that kindness can change a life. And if you want to see more stories like this, filled with emotion, truth, and hope, comment "more stories" below. You'll be the first to get our next touching story. Thank you for watching, thank you for feeling, and thank you for believing that love, even the quiet kind, still changes everything.